The Watcher on Blackridge Moor. In the autumn of 1872, the village of Harrogate, nestled in the shadow of Blackridge Moor, was a small, isolated place, untouched by the rush of progress that was spreading across England. Life was slow, the moors were wild, and the people were deeply superstitious. No one ventured onto the moor after dark, and few ever spoke of the thing that was said to live there, the Watcher. In the autumn of 1872, the village of Harrogate, nestled in the shadow of Blackridge Moor, was a small, isolated place, untouched by the rush of progress that was spreading across England. Life was slow, the moors were wild, and the people were deeply superstitious. No one ventured onto the moor after dark, and few ever spoke of the thing that was said to live there, the Watcher. Thomas Bellamy was an outsider, a land surveyor from London, sent to map the area as plans for the new railway line pushed ever closer to the wild northern countryside. The villagers were polite but distant, their unease palpable when Thomas mentioned his intent to survey the moor. They warned him of the Watcher, the ancient presence that guarded the barren hills. But Thomas dismissed it as local folklore, a relic of an older, more fearful time. He set off for the moor on an unusually warm October morning, determined to complete his work before the weather turned. The sky was grey and oppressive, the air thick with the smell of peat and damp earth. The moor stretched out like a vast, undulating sea of heather and rock, with no signs of life for miles. As Thomas climbed higher, the village became a distant memory, swallowed by the fog that crept along the edges of the landscape. By midday, he reached the highest point on Blackridge, a flat, desolate expanse known locally as the Watcher's Rest. Here, a crumbling stone circle stood, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The stones were large and irregular, arranged in a rough pattern that felt unnervingly deliberate. Thomas felt an unnatural chill as he approached, despite the warmth of the day. There was something wrong about this place, something ancient and watching. He set up his equipment quickly, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. As he worked, a low, distant sound caught his attention, a deep rhythmic thudding like footsteps. He paused, listening, but the sound faded into the wind. He convinced himself it was nothing, perhaps just the echo of his own steps magnified by the emptiness of the moor. But then, as he glanced at the stone circle, he noticed something strange. A figure stood at the far edge of the moor, barely visible through the fog, a tall, thin silhouette. At first, Thomas thought it was a trick of the light or his imagination, but the figure remained unmoving. It watched him from a distance, a dark blot against the grey sky. Thomas called out, but there was no response. He considered walking toward it, but a deep, instinctual fear held him back. The figure didn't feel human, it felt wrong, as though it were part of the moor itself, ancient and malevolent. The locals' warnings echoed in his mind. Asterisk. The Watcher sees all who walk the moor. He watches, he waits, but never follows. Thomas decided it was time to leave. He hurriedly packed his tools, his eyes flicking back to the figure which had not moved. As he descended the hill, the fog thickened, the air growing colder with each step. His breath came in short bursts, panic gnawing at his resolve. The moor was no longer just an empty landscape, it felt alive, watching him, the silence deafening. By the time he reached the lower slopes, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. The path back to Harrogate seemed longer than he remembered, the village lights far too distant. As darkness fell, the fog closed in, and the sense of being watched became unbearable. But there was no sound, no movement, just the unrelenting silence. Thomas reached the village just as night fully descended. The villagers watched him with wary eyes as he staggered through the streets, pale and shaken. He returned to the small inn where he was staying and immediately ordered a stiff drink. His hands trembled as he recounted the figure on the moor to the innkeeper, a grizzled man named Joseph who had lived in Harrogate all his life. Joseph listened quietly, his face grim. "You saw the Watcher," he said at last. "He watches all who enter his domain. If you saw him, then he saw you." Thomas dismissed the idea, trying to shake off the lingering fear. He had seen something, yes, but it was no ghost, no spirit of the moor. Yet that night, as he lay in his bed, the events replayed in his mind. The figure standing motionless in the fog, the oppressive silence, the feeling that he had crossed into something far older than he could understand. He fell into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with dark, towering shapes and the feeling of being watched. The next morning, Thomas resolved to finish his survey and leave Harrogate for good. He packed his things and set out once more, determined to complete his task before the next train out. The villagers watched him go with silent disapproval, a few making the sign of the cross as he passed. The moor was even more foreboding under the heavy clouds, the sky threatening rain. As Thomas climbed back to the stone circle, the weight of the previous day's encounter hung over him. He worked quickly, focusing on his maps and measurements, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that he was not alone. By noon, the wind had picked up, whipping through the heather. Thomas glanced up from his work and froze. The figure was back. This time it stood closer at the edge of the stone circle, its tall, thin form silhouetted against the sky. It still did not move, it simply watched. A cold dread spread through Thomas as he realized the figure had gotten closer without him hearing a sound. His heart pounded in his chest, and he fought the urge to run. But as he stepped back, his foot caught on something hard, and he stumbled, falling onto the wet ground. Looking down, he saw it wasn't a stone he had tripped on, but bones, human bones. The skeletal remains were half buried in the moor, their position suggesting they had been deliberately placed there long ago in some kind of ritualistic manner. Panic surged through him. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning his equipment, and ran. He ran faster than he thought possible, his feet slipping on the uneven ground as the wind howled around him. The Watcher remained still, but he felt its eyes on him, boring into his back as he fled. The path twisted, and he found himself disoriented in the fog, the landscape unfamiliar. As he stumbled blindly, the ground beneath him gave way. Thomas tumbled down a steep incline, crashing into the rocky earth below. Dazed, he struggled to his feet, his leg twisted painfully beneath him, but he could no longer see the village, no longer tell where he had come from. The moor had swallowed him whole. In the distance, the Watcher stood, unmoving. The next day, a search party from Harrogate found Thomas Bellamy's body at the base of the incline, his neck broken from the fall. His equipment was discovered scattered across the moor, untouched. The villagers said little as they buried him in the small churchyard, a quiet service with no fanfare. But they knew, as they had always known, that Blackridge Moor belonged to the Watcher. And those who saw him never truly left, for even in death, the Watcher would keep his gaze upon them forever.